This is not the version that the story told, but the version it has tried to hide.
Pompey's plan for reorganizing the East. The Senate neither approved nor rejected it, only saying it would be discussed again. However, Pompey was ultimately a man who craved vanity. Between the consulship and a triumph, he chose the latter. Given Pompey's prestige, if he had run for consul, he would have certainly been elected. After holding his triumph, Pompey suffered great humiliation in the Senate. For someone so vain, the promised farmland for his soldiers never materialized, and the reform plan he promised for the East couldn't be implemented. Either this was a real slap in the face for him. At this time, all three of the Senate's power players wanted to suppress Pompey. Cato the Younger believed that over the years, Pompey had repeatedly broken the rules despite lacking the proper qualifications. He was always granted command of the army. Next is Lucullus, who harbored a grudge against Pompey because not only did Pompey push Lucullus out of the Eastern campaign, but he also performed even better than Lucullus. So, whenever there was an opportunity to embarrass Pompey, Lucullus would support it. The other person was Cicero. Cicero believed that during the Catiline conspiracy, it was he who turned the tide and resolved the crisis. So Cicero's efforts to suppress Pompey were meant to highlight the superiority of civil officials over military commanders. Of course, Pompey also tried to change this situation. Before returning to Rome, Pompey had already heard that Caesar had cuckolded him. So on his way back, he divorced his wife, Lucilla. Pompey wanted to win over young Cato, so he proposed to marry Cato's sister. Unexpectedly, Cato didn't think much of Pompey at all. After all, Pompey was a triumphant general who had made his name across the entire Mediterranean by the age of 45. Yet now he was being looked down upon by a 34-year-old junior senator. Pompey's pride was deeply wounded. In a fit of anger, he really did get angry. He immediately left Rome and holed up in his villa outside the city, refusing to come out. In 60 BC, Caesar stepped down from his post early and returned to Rome, only to face the same problem as Pompey. He had to choose between holding a triumph and running for consul, because the Senate used the same trick against Caesar. Although Caesar's prestige wasn't really enough to warrant suppression by the Senate absolutely hated him, because over the years Caesar had been working to overthrow the senatorial system. By now, he had become the representative of the anti-Senate faction. Both the consulship and the triumph would have been firsts for Caesar, so he agonized over the decision. In the end, Caesar made a different choice from Pompey. He gave up the honor and chose power, deciding to enter the city of Rome to submit his application as a candidate for consul. But the Senate was determined not to let Caesar become consul, so they arranged for two very strong competitors to run against him. If Caesar wanted to win the election, he could only rely on the votes of the common people. But by giving up the triumph, it meant that the people never got to witness Caesar's moment of glory, which had a huge impact on whether he would be elected. So Caesar approached Pompey, and the two reached an agreement. Pompey would mobilize his former subordinates to help Caesar get elected, and after Caesar became consul, he would help Pompey fulfill his promise to distribute farmland to his veterans, as well as agree to Pompey's proposed reforms in the East. With that, Caesar's election was all but guaranteed. However, the balance of power between Caesar and Pompey was far too uneven. In order to balance the power dynamics, Caesar suggested bringing Crassus into the alliance. Crassus had always seen Pompey as a rival, so as long as Pompey was involved in something, Crassus wanted to have a hand in it too. However, Pompey looked down on Crassus, but because of Crassus. However, since Crassus was a leading figure in the economic sector, and the successful implementation of his own reform plans for the East depended on the influence of the economic circles, he agreed to let Crassus join. Thus, in the spring of 60 BC, the famous First Triumvirate was officially formed. Next, it was finally time for Caesar to showcase his talent. We all know that when Caesar was assassinated, he was stabbed 23 times by the senators in the Senate. So what kind of deep-seated hatred or resentment could lead to so many stabs? And when exactly did Caesar become such a thorn in the side of the Senate faction? Some say it was in 48 BC, the year he defeated Pompey. Others say it was in 49 BC, the year he crossed the Rubicon. But in fact, it was neither. It was from the very moment the First Triumvirate was formed, that is, in 60 BC. That year Caesar leveraged the advantage of the triumvirate and was elected consul by an overwhelming majority. The Senate thought Caesar was nothing more than a petty clown. They had already subdued Pompey. How could a mere Caesar pose any threat? So they let their guard down against Caesar. But the ridiculous thing was, even after Caesar had been consul for half a year, the Senate still had no idea that the triumvirate even existed. By the time the triumvirate surfaced, Rome was already firmly under Caesar's control. On the 1st of January, 59 BC, Caesar officially took office as consul, and as soon as he assumed power, he bared his fangs at the Senate. Caesar introduced a series of bills in quick succession, each one striking directly at the Senate's most vulnerable points. Others had tried this before, but not only did they fail, they also met with miserable ends. But Caesar was different. His political maneuvering was so masterful that he had the Senate dancing in the palm of his hand. The first system Caesar introduced was called the Consul's Bulletin, which was essentially the equivalent of today's People's Daily. After every Senate meeting, the contents of the discussions would be made public. Who said what, and what topics were discussed at the meeting, would all be posted on the walls of the Roman Forum for everyone to see. Caesar's reasoning for doing this was that since citizens had the right to vote, they also had the right to know everything. This argument left the senators with no way to refute him. After all, things that can't stand the light of day are rarely good, so this system shook one of the Senate's privileges. Second, Caesar enacted the Lex Julia de Ambitu, also translated as the Julian Civil Service Law. As the name suggests, this law was meant to regulate and manage public officials. Years later, this law was even included by Emperor Justinian in the Corpus Juris Civilis, which shows just how forward-thinking Caesar was at the time. The law stipulated that public officials were not allowed to accept gifts exceeding 10,000 sesterces. This amount was equivalent to the total salary of a soldier for 35 years. This law essentially cut off the senators' sources of income because at the time, the highest-ranking positions, such as provincial governors, were monopolized by the Senate, while lower-level public offices offered little opportunity for personal gain. Third, in the Julian law on citizenship, Caesar stipulated that public officials must publish the list of taxpayers. Under the supervision of the general public, this could effectively prevent abuse of power and corruption. What Caesar was doing was overthrowing the old system and establishing a new order. The so-called Old System was the Roman Republic led by the Senate, while the New Order referred to the era of emperors. Rome was no longer a small city-state, but a world power that had turned the entire Mediterranean into its own inland sea. After the country expanded, the old systems were no longer suitable. For example, the commonly used system of citizen voting. With the citizen voting system, how many Roman citizens scattered across various regions would actually be willing to travel all the way to Rome just to exercise their right to vote? So, in that era without voting apps, the only people who truly exercised their civic rights were the Roman citizens living near the capital. Given that, it might actually be more efficient to leave national affairs in the hands of a small group of elites. By this time in China, it had already been more than 160 years since Qin Shi Huang Yingjing declared himself emperor, and Caesar's entire life was dedicated to achieving this very goal of becoming emperor. Fourth, Caesar made significant contributions to eliminating usury. At that time, many members of the Senate engaged in usury to exploit the poor. Among them, Brutus, the main conspirator in Caesar's assassination, charged interest rates as high as 48% on his loans. Caesar set a new rule that annual interest rates could not exceed 12%. Moreover, under the laws introduced by Caesar, anyone who violated them would not only face corresponding penalties but would also be expelled from the Senate. This explains why Caesar was stabbed so many times during his assassination, because for these senators, if they didn't get a stab in, they simply couldn't let it go. Fifth is the land law. The land law was like a landmine. Every time this issue was touched upon, bloody conflicts inevitably broke out. To put it simply, the land law meant taking land from the rich and redistributing it to the poor, with priority given to soldiers who had previously followed Pompey. This finally allowed Pompey to hold his head high again. Touching the land law was like touching the lifeblood of the Senate faction, so the senators were bound to oppose it. The one who protested the loudest was Cato the Younger. Caesar had no choice but to throw Cato the Younger out during the meeting, but the other members of the Senate still refused to cooperate. Caesar said, "In that case, we'll have to let the People's Assembly decide." It was precisely because of this People's Assembly that the long-secret First Triumvirate finally came to light. The People's Assembly that day was presided over by Caesar. In Rome, the two consuls took turns governing, each for a month, and Caesar deliberately chose to hold the assembly in March, the month when he was in charge. Caesar let Cato the Younger take the stage to speak first, but this time Caesar didn't even need to intervene. Cato had barely begun his speech opposing the land reform law when he was dragged off the podium. Fortunately, a few strong senators protected Cato the Younger as he left, otherwise he would have been beaten up by the crowd. Next, Caesar invited the other consul, Bibulus, to speak. Bibulus belonged to the Senate faction and also opposed the land reform law. Although he was a consul just like Caesar, he had been constrained by Caesar ever since taking office. When he saw the hostility the citizens showed toward Cato the Younger, even his voice was very quiet when he took the stage. He only weakly said that, according to the augury, today was not a suitable day to discuss this matter, and then stepped down amid the citizens' boos and laughter. After that, Caesar invited Crassus, one of the members of the First Triumvirate, to speak on stage. Crassus's speech was very brief. He simply said he agreed with the land reform law, and then stepped down from the podium. The citizens responded with enthusiastic applause, because Crassus's agreement signified the support of the business community. Next, it was Pompey's turn to speak. Since Pompey was not good at public speaking, Caesar read out each clause of the Julian land law one by one, asking Pompey after each one whether he agreed. Pompey was also one of the members of the First Triumvirate, so of course his answer was in agreement. And every time Pompey answered in agreement, the crowd would erupt in enthusiastic applause. After Pompey had agreed to all the clauses, Caesar did not let him leave. Caesar said that merely passing the bill was not enough. It also required someone who was both wise and brave, and handsome. Only the most handsome, respected, and invincible person in the universe should supervise the execution. Caesar hoped that Pompey would take on this important task. Before Pompey could respond, Caesar turned to the citizens and shouted, "For such an important responsibility, shouldn't we ask the great Pompey to take it on?" The citizens loudly chanted, "Bang bang da." Although Pompey was not an ambitious man, his vanity was strong. Amid the cheers of the crowd, he started to get carried away, even forgetting that he wasn't good at public speaking. Pompey shouted loudly, "I am deeply honored to receive such great favor from the consul and the citizens." He then went on to strongly emphasize the necessity of land reform. Finally, Pompey said, "If anyone points a sword at this bill, I, Pompey, will become a shield to protect it." The atmosphere had reached its peak, and the cheers of the people were as loud as thunder. Seeing that the land reform bill was about to pass, the Senate hurriedly pushed the other consul, Bibulus, onto the podium, since as consul he had the power to veto. Caesar immediately shouted, drowning out Bibulus's voice, "Fellow citizens, as long as Consul Bibulus disagrees, no matter how loudly you shout, it won't do a damn thing." After hearing this, everyone enthusiastically rushed up to the podium. Bibulus was so frightened that he had no choice but to give up his veto power and fled in panic. It was only at this point that everyone realized Caesar, Pompey, and Crassus were already allies in cahoots. The Roman way of recording years was to name them after the two consuls in office. The citizens jokingly said that 59 BC was the year of Julius and Caesar as consuls, not the year of Caesar and Bibulus as consuls. Because during this period, Caesar held all the power by himself. This was the power of the first triumvirate. The Roman Republic, led by the Senate, ultimately collapsed because of the emergence of the triumvirate. Caesar was truly a kind-hearted man. He made Pompey a cuckold, causing Pompey to divorce his wife, and afterwards, he even made sure to find Pompey a new wife. Generously, Caesar married off his 22-year-old daughter Julia to the 47-year-old Pompey, and Pompey was completely smitten with his young wife. After taking care of Pompey's affairs, Caesar turned to his own since he had also been cuckolded and divorced his wife. He found himself a new wife as well, named Calpurnia. Caesar chose her because his father-in-law was highly influential in the Senate, and he hoped to rely on him to solve his upcoming employment issues. The year Caesar became consul was truly a double harvest of love and career. That same year, the Egyptian king Ptolemy XII lost his throne, and Caesar decided to send legions to help him reclaim it. The person leading the troops was a former subordinate of Pompey, so Egypt became Pompey's protege. To show his gratitude, the Egyptian king promised to give both Pompey and Caesar 3,000 talents each. More importantly, the Egyptian king had a 10-year-old daughter named Cleopatra, commonly known as the Queen of Egypt. 10 years later, she would become Caesar's lover. Besides the Egyptian king, the leader of the Germanic tribes, Ariovistus, also became good friends with Rome. However, in the upcoming Gallic Wars, Ariovistus would turn into Caesar's formidable opponent. As a consul, Caesar's one-year term was about to end, and resolving his own employment issue had become an urgent matter. But the Senate had a special privilege. Before the consular election, they could decide where the consul would be assigned after his term ended. The position Caesar was chosen for was Forest Road Administrator, which basically meant not letting Caesar take control of the legion. Under Caesar's direction, the tribune Vatinius proposed the Vatinius Law, which was to change Caesar's workplace and appoint him as governor of 2 Gallic provinces south of the Alps, granting him command of 3 legions for a term of 5 years. Of course, the senators opposed this kind of breaking with tradition. At this point, Caesar's newly found father-in-law came in handy. After his father-in-law's persuasion, many senators voted in favor. However, the Senate faction led by Cato still refused to agree. Cato even insulted Caesar to his face, accusing him of using women to achieve his own goals, calling him a despicable, shameless, vulgar, filthy, insidious, and malicious scoundrel. Caesar was not about to indulge Cato and his followers. He once again used the power of the first triumvirate to submit the bill to the popular assembly for a decision. Since both Pompey and Crassus agreed, the popular assembly was sure to pass the bill as well. Shortly after the bill was passed, the governor of the province of Gaul, located north of the Alps, suddenly died. Caesar quickly amended the bill to add his own place of appointment, which is present-day southern France. With the addition of a legion stationed in southern France, Caesar now had command over 4 legions. The Senate was powerless in this situation and could only watch as Caesar consolidated his authority. During the remaining 3 months of Caesar's consulship, even Cicero, who was usually passionate about politics, went into hiding and focused on his studies. Caesar, on the other hand, was preparing for his post-consulship future. First, Caesar needed to find a way to remotely control Rome. Although he would be leaving for Gaul, his mind would still be on Rome, and during his 5-year term as governor in Gaul, he would not be allowed to return to Rome. If he crossed the Rubicon River and returned to the capital, it would mean he would automatically forfeit his position as governor and his command over the legions. Therefore, after discussions among Caesar, Pompey, and Crassus, the so-called First Triumvirate, they decided to have Piso and Gabinius serve as consuls for the following year, that is, 58 BC. Piso was Caesar's father-in-law, while Gabinius was a close confidant of Pompey. With Caesar, Pompey, and Crassus the 3 heads of the triumvirate in control, the candidates recommended by the Senate for consul had no chance at all. Caesar believed that merely having 2 puppet consuls was not enough, because Crassus only knew how to make money and had almost no political ability, while Pompey was only interested in playing cards with his young wife. What Caesar needed now was someone who could argue with Cato and also pose a threat to Cicero. Caesar wasn't sure when he first set his sights on this young man he was none other than Clodius Pulcher, the one suspected of having an affair with Caesar's wife. Pulcher's ambition was to run for the office of tribune of the plebs, and for this, he was willing to give up his noble status and be adopted by a plebeian family, because only plebeians were eligible to run for that office. However, abandoning one's noble status to become a plebeian could only be done with the approval of Rome's Pontifex Maximus. The senatorial faction believed that such a humiliating act for the nobility would never be approved, even by Caesar, who was the Pontifex Maximus. However, not only did Caesar approve it, he also took advantage of the power of the first triumvirate to help Pulcher successfully get elected as tribune of the plebs. As a result, after the current tribune, Vatinius, the next tribune, Pulcher, was also a close ally of Caesar. After Caesar had finally arranged everything, he suddenly received news that something major had happened in Gaul, the region where he was about to take office. Did you know? If it weren't for Caesar, Switzerland as we know it today might not exist. If it weren't for Caesar, there might be a place called Switzerland in western France. If it weren't for Caesar, the Swiss people might have disappeared from the world long ago. So, what exactly is the connection between Caesar and Switzerland? In the 1st century BC, Switzerland was part of the region known as Gaul. The region of Gaul refers to what is now Western Europe, roughly divided by the Rhine River, mainly including France, Belgium, Switzerland, southern Netherlands, and northern Italy. Of course, although Gaul at that time was still undeveloped, with forests and swamps far outnumbering farmland, the climate was mild and there was plenty of water. According to experts' estimates, the amount of agricultural products and livestock available here was enough to support tens of thousands of people. Although many people lived there, there was no unified government. Instead, there were hundreds of tribes of various sizes. For the Gauls, their main threat did not come from the Romans to the south, but from the Germanic peoples east of the Rhine. Although only separated by a river, the climate on the eastern side was much harsher than on the west. Whenever the Germanic tribes to the east suffered from famine, they would cross the Rhine and bully the Gauls. The Helvetii, who were part of the Gauls, could no longer endure the bullying from the Germanic tribes and decided to migrate en masse to the far west of Gaul, near the Atlantic Ocean. The Helvetii are the ancestors of the Swiss, and this name is still in use today. The Helvetii burned down their old homeland, and a total of 368,000 people began their westward migration. They had two possible routes to choose from. The first was to head directly west, which was the shortest path, but it would pass through the territories of many powerful tribes and could easily lead to war. The second option was to go south into the Roman province, and then continue westward. Although this route was longer, as long as they obtained permission from the Roman governor, it would be much safer than the first route. When the Helvetii began their westward migration, it was 58 BC. That year, the governor of the Gallic province was none other than Caesar. Caesar decisively rejected the Helvetii's request to pass through, because it was impossible for a group of over 300,000 people to travel through the Roman province without incident. Moreover, the place where the Helvetii planned to move was not uninhabited. The Pictones and Santones had lived there for many years. If the Helvetii arrived there, war would inevitably break out. After being refused by Caesar, the Helvetii decided to take the first route and head directly west. However, even before the migration began, they had already clashed with the tribes along the way. So the Helvetii took the second route. At this time, Caesar was still in Rome, originally planning to hold a proper farewell ceremony before leaving, since he would be gone for 5 years. But thanks to the Helvetii, he could only set out in haste with a few cavalrymen. As soon as Caesar arrived at his post, he ordered the immediate assembly of 4 legions, the 7th, 8th, 9th, and 10th legions. The 4 legions combined had only 24,000 men, which made it truly difficult to confront the more than 300,000 migrating Helvetii. So, without the Senate's approval, Caesar urgently formed 2 more legions, the 11th and 12th legions. Before all the legions had assembled, Caesar set out with the 10th legion, which was closest to him, and ordered the other legions to pursue him as soon as they had gathered. Caesar led the 10th legion across the Alps and arrived at the Rhone River. The Rhone River was the boundary between the Roman province and Gaul. Caesar ordered the 10th legion to build a barrier along the Rhone River, stretching 28 kilometers long and 4.8 meters high. A trench was also dug outside the barrier, making it impossible for the Helvetii to use their bows and arrows. The Helvetii had no choice but to go back and take the first route. They also asked the Aedui for help, hoping the Aedui could persuade the tribes along the way to let them pass. The Aedui were the most powerful tribe along the route, and they were also allies of Rome. The nobility of this tribe even enjoyed Roman citizenship. The leader of the Aedui agreed to the Helvetii's request. As expected, something unexpected happened. With more than 300,000 people migrating, minor frictions along the way quickly escalated into major chaos. The Aedui asked Caesar, the governor of the nearest province, to come and clean up their mess. Although this was a request from an ally, Rome would still need the Senate's approval to send troops. But Caesar didn't care about the Senate at all. He took action before waiting for any instructions from them. In May of 58 BC, Caesar crossed the border of the southern province of France and entered Gaul, launching the Gallic Wars that would last 7 years. It was also through this war that Caesar reached the pinnacle of his life. After entering Gaul, Caesar relentlessly pursued and attacked the Helvetii, and after countless brutal battles, he finally subdued them. The Helvetii handed over hostages, surrendered their weapons, and compensated the Aedui for their losses. Caesar ordered them to return to the homeland they had abandoned. However, the Helvetii had already burned their old homes to the ground, so returning meant only facing starvation. Therefore, Caesar required the other Gallic tribes to provide aid to the Helvetii and help them get through this difficult time. Because if Switzerland became uninhabited, the Germans would cross the Rhine and occupy the area, which would further threaten the Roman provinces. The poor Helvetii, when they began their great migration, they numbered 368,000. But now, only 110,000 returned to their homeland, most of the rest having been slaughtered by Caesar and his Roman legions. It's hard to say what kind of feelings modern Swiss people have towards Caesar. Although the Helvetii migration was quelled, the root cause of the incident was the Germanic invasion. Caesar believed that next, he should give the Germans a good thrashing. We all know that the Gallic Wars were Caesar's moment of glory. But why did Caesar launch the Gallic Wars in the first place? Roman soldiers were short and unimpressive, so how did they manage to defeat the tall, mighty, battle-hardened, and numerous barbarian tribes? And how did Caesar gradually incorporate the Gallic region into the Roman territory step by step? In fact, in the so-called Gallic Wars, the real enemy was not the Gauls, but the Germans who, more than 500 years later, would destroy the Western Roman Empire. In 58 BC, when Caesar took office as governor of the province of Gaul, he immediately stopped the mass migration of 368,000 Helvetians. Then, he encouraged the Gallic tribal leaders to hold a meeting, persuading them to proactively request that Caesar help the Gauls deal with the Germans who had crossed the Rhine. At that time, there were already as many as 120,000 Germans who had crossed the Rhine and settled in Gaul. If Rome did not intervene, it was only a matter of time before the Germans took over the entire region of Gaul. Caesar began a correspondence with Ariovistus, the leader of the Germans. Caesar said that the Aedui of Gaul were good friends of Rome, but now they were being forced to give you hostages, which was a great embarrassment for Rome. Moreover, the Germans have crossed the Rhine in large numbers and are launching major incursions into Gaul, which threatens the security of Rome. Caesar demanded that Ariovistus stop allowing more Germans to cross the Rhine, release the hostages from the Aedui, and cease bullying the tribes of the Gaulish region. In response, Ariovistus replied to Caesar, saying that Caesar was merely a Roman general and that he did not understand why Caesar was acting like a great chieftain, meddling in these affairs.
Subscribe to Animystika not to miss anything. Like and share, and join me right away for a new trip in history.